Welcome to TeamTalk from TeamKinetic, the podcast that takes a deeper dive into volunteer management with me, Chris Martin. Welcome to TeamTalk from TeamKinetic with me, Chris Martin.
And me, Imo Greatbatch. TeamTalk is the podcast that dives deeper into the world of volunteer management, getting to know the people who help make volunteering happen, why they do it, how they do it, and what they want to see change. If you're new to listening to the podcast, a big welcome. But if you've listened before, welcome back. Great to have you coming back to us.
So how's your, it's been a couple of weeks, how's your couple of weeks been, Imo?
Very good. The wonders of school holidays, but also balancing with work. Spent a nice week in Gower, actually. Lovely going to the Home Nations. That was nice.
Lovely part of the world. We've got lots to talk about in this episode, so we'll cut the small talk and we'll go get straight in there. This week, we're joined by Kristen Natale, who is Head of Volunteering at Sports England. Kristen, welcome to Team Talk.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Imo. Great to be here.
So Kristen has over 10 years experience in volunteering development, working with partners across a range of sectors. Kristen's passionate about the power of volunteering to create happier and healthier communities. And we're super excited to have you with us today. So welcome, Kristen.
So we like to start at the beginning, Kristen, and get to know you a little bit and how you found your way to where you are today, really, and how you ended up choosing a job in the voluntary sector, so to speak. I know Sport England's not really the voluntary sector completely, but the audience that listens to this podcast will be interested to understand sort of people's journeys in the strange world of volunteer management. If you'd like to tell us a little bit about where you started and what ignited your passion for volunteering.
Yeah, sure. So I think that the kind of journey that I've had probably is going to sound a little bit familiar based on some of the guests you've had on this show, in that being in volunteer management wasn't necessarily a life ambition, wasn't necessarily a career that I planned, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that it is a career that I've been doing for some time. Coming out of university, I guess, I graduated having studied history, and I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do off the back of that degree. I grew up in West Cumbria, just outside of the Lake District, and returning back from university, I sort of started to think about, okay, what do I want to do next? What opportunities are there local to me? And what opportunities are there further afield? I also had the luck, I guess, or was very unlucky in terms of graduating into a recession back in 2008.
Yeah.
Which meant that opportunities were maybe more limited than they could have been. So essentially, I guess I started to sort of look around at things that I could do locally to gain some experience and to just really sort of start to think about, where are my skills and strengths and where can I make an impact? Because, well, certainly for me and my experience as a graduate was I came out of university. I was the first member of family to go to university. And I sort of really needed to sort of find my feet and sort of think about, well, what does this mean now in terms of what do I want to do day to day? Yeah. And I certainly had an instinct that I didn't want to do a role that was about making money, that was about profit, that was, in that commercial space.
Yeah.
I wanted to do something that was very much rooted in communities and rooted in making lives better for people. That's what mattered to me.
It's a funny thing as well, I think, when you're sort of, 19, 20, 21, 22, and you're having them sort of thoughts, it's quite difficult to put them in context for your life. I have a similar sort of experience. I knew I didn't want a sort of a traditional job in an office, and I knew that I wanted to do something that made a difference to people's lives, but I didn't really have a framework by which to sort of place that in an actual job at 21, 22. I was a bit sort of lost in what does that actually mean kind of thing, and it felt a bit cheesy. I've ever said it out loud to anybody that I want to make the world a better place. It was like, get lost, you hippie sort of thing. So yeah, I can very much relate to that sort of, you come home and it's like, what now kind of.
Yeah, so I definitely had that sort of feeling. And being honest, in West Cumbria, there's not the wealth of opportunities that there are in other places in the country, in other cities. So yeah, completely identify with what you just said there. I kind of needed to find my way and see what's out there. Like, I think the charity and the voluntary sector at that time, certainly back in 2008, sort of felt like it the opportunities that were available and the diversity of those opportunities that I know quite well now, there's a huge range of roles that you can do, huge range of specialism and expertise that you can gain, but that just wasn't a really obvious thing to me at that time. So it was really by chance that I just started looking around for roles in that area. And it was through a friend that I'd known for a long time through school who said, oh, actually, there's a role at a local charity in Age UK. So Age UK West Cumbria had a role. It was an admin role, actually working on quality standards. That was the role that I applied for. I thought, well, this is great. I can get some real life, office-based admin experience, which will just add value to my CV. And I can just get used to like being in the world of work. And like you say, just sort of finding my feet. What am I good at? What am I not so good at? Building those relationships. Yeah, so that's what I started to do. And that role, as if anyone is listening has worked in a small charity, that role rapidly expanded into working on many different things. So yeah, starting out doing admin to support quality standards. They were going for ISO 9001 accreditation at the time, so quite a big quality standard. But yeah, then they ended up helping out with admin across a number of different projects and programs. So a local Age UK runs a really diverse range of programs and services, and loads of that is supported by amazing volunteers from that local community. So day centres, transport, charity shops, befriending schemes, volunteers doing a whole range of things out there in the community. So I started to see that there was this whole other world that almost I didn't know about, and this group of people who were local to me, who were just doing this amazing amount of work and giving so much time and energy and enthusiasm to help other people, in this case, older people. And so, like you say, it does sound cheesy and hopefully it doesn't sound a bit cringe, but it does really open your eyes to, one, the need in the community or the challenges that people might be facing, but also the kind of energy and the assets within that community that with the right support from an organization, and often the voluntary sector is doing this, can be mobilized to actually address some of those local issues, and volunteers are really at the heart of that. So I started getting involved in lots of different things, more kind of, I guess, in the kind of project development, business development side. And then the volunteering bit came in because they had a volunteer manager who'd been doing the role for about 10 years.
Okay.
Really experienced, really amazing, very much a people person, as most people in the profession are. And she decided to move on, and the chief executive came up to me one day and said, oh, hey, Kristen, I've got another really great learning experience for you. Would you fancy taking on volunteering as well? And I was like, And I didn't really.
What you were doing, the project work you were doing, and the ISO stuff, and the quality assurance. So this was like another string to your.
Or like was it a package within the role that you were currently delivering, or was it a new opportunity in which you sort of recruit support in to do what you were currently doing?
Yeah, it was an add-on. I was in a place though, I guess, at that point in my career, and it was, that experience working at Age UK West Cumbria for 4 and a bit years was transformational for me, like on a personal and professional level completely. But I was in a point in my career where basically I just said yes to things. That was my approach, that I would say yes to things and I'd figure out how I was going to make it work later. Which I don't know whether that's career advice necessarily, but when you're trying to learn and develop, being bold and saying, I'll step up and try that is quite useful.
What you said at the start about the role expanding, I think it's quite interesting. I think that probably doesn't happen for everyone. I think it speaks to maybe what you're like as a person, and the role probably expanded because they saw you were capable, and they kept on giving you more stuff because you want things doing. You ask a busy person, and you probably came across as that person who gets stuff done. But I do think it speaks to the sector that, as you say, if you get your foot on the ladder, you get into that space. The breadth of opportunity is really for young people coming into the world of work. It's quite an exciting place to be. I think, like you say, it does have that potential to be transformational and help you develop confidence and those kind of skills that I think if you go in a more corporate world, you may not necessarily have the same freedom or certainly a different kind of experience, I would suggest. I don't know. I've never been in the corporate world, so I don't know. Maybe you guys can tell me better than I can.
Yeah, me neither. I think I'd agree with you, though, that the freedom that I had to try things and to maybe step up and take on maybe more responsibility than you would be given in a more kind of structured environment like a corporate world, or even, I guess, in the public sector. Some areas of the public sector can be quite structured as well. I think, I was in a space or at that point in my life where I was sort of saying yes to things because I really had that appetite and enthusiasm to learn. I wasn't quite sure at that point where it was taking me, hence the many strings to my bow. I'll sort of figure out where I can really make an impact. And as long as I felt like I could do the role justice, or what I was being asked to do justice, then I was fairly comfortable with that. But I think one of the things that really helped me, you mentioned confidence there, and I had to really sort of work hard, I guess, to build my confidence to feel like I could do those things. And I had a really good mentor when I was in that organization. So the chief executive at the time, Mary Bradley, shout out to Mary, because Mary is amazing. She really took me under her wing and could see potential in me that I couldn't see in myself, and could see that with a bit of support and with stepping into those opportunities and saying yes to things and trying things, even if it was scary, that I could gradually over time kind of build my confidence. And I did. And I think I did things in that role that I wouldn't have necessarily thought I could do if I hadn't had that support. Yeah.
I mean, I know now in sort of my business that when you have a young person that says yes to stuff, it's one of the best things in the world, because you just know that you can go, do you want to try this? It just takes that sort of pressure off, that you've got somebody that you can rely on. It's an underrated skill for young people as sort of making their way in the world of work, I think, is that willingness to give stuff a try without the sort of too much fear of failure. I think it's something I'm trying to encourage in my own kids at the minute. So you had what sounds like a pretty good grounding in the sector, so to speak. But I was interested when you said you didn't see it as a career. And now I guess in your role where you are now, is there something we can do about that within volunteer management? And maybe not in volunteer management, but the third sector as a whole. Is there something that we should be thinking of as a sector? Maybe we'll come back around to this at the end. I'm diving sort of in, but this idea that, again, I didn't see the voluntary sector as a career when I left university. Is there something we're missing there? We're missing a trick, or has it changed, do you think, since we all left university all those years ago?
Yeah, I think it has changed, because that is quite a while ago now, isn't it? So I started that role in 2009. So I think it has changed. I think young people have a real passion, and we have data and evidence that shows this now as well. Young people have a real passion to make a difference, and I think that in terms of people's priorities when they're making job and career choices is really front and center of their thinking. A lot of people now, their time is precious. They want work-life balance, and they want to have an impact, a positive impact. It isn't all about, well, I want to climb the career ladder, or I want to make as much money as I can. I think that has shifted and is continuing to shift for people of all ages. But I think young people coming through and looking for the first career, I think particularly it's important. I think it has changed. I think people are looking for roles, whether it's in the charity sector or the third sector, or whether it's in like social enterprises, or whether it's in, the corporate social responsibility space, where actually businesses and brands are now stepping up and looking at how they can have a positive impact on the world as well. I think people are looking for those spaces. Thinking back to my kind of personal experience, I think I hadn't really realized when I started out, okay, I'm gonna work in this small local charity for a period of time and gain some skills and experience. I suppose as that role developed, what was going to be, a bit of a stopgap to give me some thinking space and gain some experience for a year or so became a 4-year job. So it evolved into something that I was genuinely committed to and could see a future in, not necessarily in that organization forever, but I was seriously considering at that time, okay, are there other charities in the area that I could work in, or even making a step almost sideways into health and social care as well. So
Yeah.
lots of my work, especially the project work, crossed over with the NHS or adult social care. And that kind of space was really interesting to me. So commissioning or developing new services.
And that space is more defined as well as an actual career path, as opposed to the more, should we say, loose-fitting side on the voluntary sector side, which is a little bit more free-flowing, should we say, in terms of the sort of the jobs and the career path that comes out of it.
Yeah. And interestingly, I didn't end up going down that route. Obviously, I ended up going in the more free-flowing space, which, I don't know what that says about me. I think it did sort of start to feel like not necessarily that organisation became a long-term kind of career choice or volunteering specifically, but I guess that sector, I think by the time I'd sort of got to the point where I was looking for new things, I was pretty convinced by that point that actually this is kind of the space for me, where I want to be. I want to continue to work in. I mean, now I've sort of been saying, is it social impact? Is it I want to be in that social impact space? I think I'm slightly more agnostic about what type of organisation that is. Yeah,
that makes sense.
And I think it's interesting because, Chris, you started to talk about this career pathway and the different things that Kristen, your younger self, was thinking about in the decision-making process. Where 4 years into Age UK, what did you learn and what sort of moved you to the National Council for Volunteer Organisations and then specialising in sport? Tell us a little bit about that kind of
big move, I can imagine, for the young Kristen, moving from West Cumbria down to the big smoke.
Yeah, it was a huge decision at the time, not just because of like the geographical distance and the contrast of West Cumbria to the capital city. Slight culture shock there, but sort of in terms of what I learned, Imo, I mean, I'd learned so much over that period of time. I think, I'd really got under the skin of volunteering and volunteer management because I'd had to kind of, when their previous volunteer manager moved on and I took on that role, I had to really understand everything, from the inside out and start to think about, how do I support all these volunteers in all these different roles, hundreds of volunteers across a number of different projects and services. How do I sort of build a better framework and modernize that framework? So, we had to get a database. There wasn't a database. It was on paper. Had to get an electronic database. So all that kind of operational stuff of how do you create the right kind of framework from the ground up, I had to do all that. And then once that was kind of working okay, I started to sort of look outside and to sort of think about, right, well, how do I actually make this better? How do I sort of strategically think about volunteering? And started to explore and do my own kind of research into what other charities and organisations were doing and what at the time Volunteering England was saying about volunteering. And I got really interested in the kind of policy and strategy space and started to look at the research and the data. And I guess the researcher from my history degree was coming out at this point. I was like really starting to sort of read quite widely around it. And I think I was also starting to see because I was really engaged in the kind of health and social care space locally as well, I was starting to see the shift in terms of where public services were going and where, ideas like asset-based community development and how you can, like, from the ground up, engage local people in supporting people from a health and well-being perspective. So there was all these ideas coming up in my head, and I was starting to realize that, okay, I'm working here in West Cumbria and working with all these different partners and all these volunteers in this space. But actually nationally, there's this whole other layer of amazing things happening as well. And you were saying about isolation at the start, Chris, it can feel quite isolating, but I was like thinking, this is so exciting. There's loads of people thinking about the same things as me. And there's really common challenges across all these different sectors in volunteering. So not only was that, because the day-to-day stuff in volunteer management was still really exciting. Like, I think if you want a crash course in learning about relationships in people, do a volunteer management role, because you learn all of that, difficult conversation, conflict resolution, negotiation, how do you develop people? You learn all of that.
That was quite morning.
Exactly. Especially in charity shops are an amazing microcosm of human life.
Yeah.
A key thing that you're sharing with us here about is that journey and kind of this world that you've sort of, through the choices you've made, you've opened up your kind of vision to, as well as moving from a rural country kind of role to a big city, very busy. I mean, I don't know whether it felt busy at Age UK and then you moved to this policy and you shared around your interest in strategy and the connection to your degree of history and your now career choice, and how that then influenced you at NCVO. But then where did the specialism in sport sort of motivation come from to move to Sport England?
You know, coming to the end of my role at Age UK West Cumbria, I'd sort of, my eyes were starting to open to this kind of national policy strategy context, which is where I initially came across NCVO and what they were doing. I guess for me, the exciting bit about that role, so I moved into a role that was called Volunteer Management and Good Practice Manager. Catchy.
Very. I don't know if that role still exists, which is a bit of a shame.
It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. So yeah, it kind of became something else later. But that role was essentially sort of looking at how do you support the network of members across the country to develop and support their volunteers. So it was looking at nationally what does good practice look like, and how do we provide tools and resources to support that. So that's what I was brought in to do, but then started to dip into lots of other elements of the work around volunteering policy and practice.
You've definitely seen a pattern wherever you go.
I know, dipping into things. Yeah, so again, that started to kind of expand, and with some organizational changes, I ended up leading the whole team. So I ended up doing a broader range of work across volunteering there, which, like you were saying, Imo, that kind of wider policy strategy research space really was where I was across. And then I also had a campaigns element because we were leading on volunteering as well. So then the kind of like the portfolio of things I was doing, it was volunteering, but it was actually touching on lots of different areas at a national level as well. But what I really found was, and I think this probably is quite a useful point when I think about sort of career pathways, was that the experience that I'd had on the ground locally and the hands-on experience I've had of, working in a small charity, supporting and managing volunteers across a range of services, really put me in a great position to really have an understanding about the challenges that our members were facing. And also, if we were looking at, say, new proposed legislation or new government policy on volunteering, I had a bit of an understanding and a good feel for how would that be received by an organisation like a local Age UK or volunteers, or how would that land in practice. So I found myself in that role a lot of the time, still using what I'd learned local landscape in that national role, which was incredibly helpful. And the thing that I really enjoyed at NCVO, I guess, was that kind of intersection between policy, practice, and research. And that's what I really, really, really liked. And I think the role that I do now at Sport England still has an element of that, for sure. So, we have that kind of national influencing leadership role. We're also a funder, which is definitely a new string to my bow.
We'll have a chat about that in a minute, I think. We'll go back to that. I'm sure there'll be people listening that'll be really interested to understand the ins and outs of how that works.
You might regret that. It's not as interesting as you think. Yeah, so there's an element of that. And obviously data and insight, we're an insight-led organisation. We have a whole insight team, which if you love reading research reports is a joy, because I get to see it first, I get to unpick it. But the thing that I really love doing, and this is going to make me sound like a huge geek, but I just really love getting hold of that stuff. So getting hold of the latest insight and data, and then just thinking, right, so what does this mean now for the organizations that we support or that we work with, or the people on the ground? So, as you say, Imo, for us now in sport, it might be sports clubs, or it might be national governing bodies like England Netball or like England Hockey, or it could just be, a volunteer who is setting up a running group for the local people that want to run weekly, and there isn't something for them, and they're they're not in that sort of structured sport space as well. So, but that kind of intersection between those three things, I find really exciting, but it's got to have an impact on the ground for me. And I think that comes because my roots are still in that local voluntary sector space
sort of thing.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, well, again, we'll probably come on to this a little bit later, but the big thing with the vision for volunteering for me is that the vision's great, but we've had lots of stuff like this in the past within volunteering. And as you just said there, turning these things, these interesting PowerPoint presentations that happen at conferences into actual real stuff that affects people's lives. That's the dark art. That's where the magic happens, and that's the bit that we, I think everybody that's involved in sort of the sector in some way, shape, or form has the desire to do. So it's what you're saying there, I think will resonate with an awful lot of people that listen. The interest in the sort of the wider context, but how does that actually make a difference to people's lives is the bit that's really interesting. You're now at Sport England. Tell us a little bit about how you're doing that. How are you making a difference? What's on your desk at the minute that's going to change the world?
Oh, I hope I am making a difference. I mean, I think a reflection on what you were just saying there, though, I think one of the challenges of being in a role like this at Sport England or at NCVO is that you are to a certain extent that one step removed from the impact.
Yeah.
So it never is, just like with Vision for Volunteering, it never is about what one person, one organization can do, right? Yeah. It's always about what can we do. In my mind, and I think, come on to this when I come to what I'm doing at the minute, I think it's about how do you bring people along with you and how can you all kind of get behind a goal or an objective, whether it's inclusion or whether it's well-being or whether it's, more participation in a sport or an activity. You have to bring other people along with you. And
how do you build that culture? How do you direct the stream, if you will, in the way that you want that everyone's kind of moving in the same direction?
Well, it's almost like you two are positioning us for a uniting the movement segue of actually what the strategy is for Sport England. So, Kristen, tell us a little bit about where volunteering sits in uniting your movement and kind of what the big issues are that's really trying to address and where volunteering fits within that.
Yeah, it has teed it up quite nicely, hasn't it? So, so Sport England strategy is hugely ambitious. So it's called Uniting the Movement, as Imo said. It's a decade-long strategy, and it's really
in and of itself. That longitudinal approach, I think, is something that's sort of been lacking a little bit over the last few years. To have something that long and that involved, I think, in itself is a win.
Yeah, I personally think it's a really positive move. I think some of the challenges that we're trying to tackle within that. So one of the things that is absolutely central to that strategy and to, in terms of our priorities is tackling inequalities.
Yeah.
So we know there's continues to be deep-rooted inequalities within sport and physical activity. So people with disability, people from low socioeconomic backgrounds are particularly, more likely to be inactive. Women are still less active than men as well. So there's still these inequalities within activity that exist. Unfortunately, some of those inequalities are also reflected when it comes to volunteering as well. So we see that pattern mirrored when we look at the demographic of people that primarily volunteer in sport. So if you volunteer in sport currently, you're more likely to be male, white, and middle class. And we need to change that. And we need to change, the culture and the behaviours across the entire sector to reduce those inequalities. So that's the sort of central focus of everything that we do. But around that, we've got other kind of big issues that we're focusing on as well that we feel are important too. So, recover and reinvent. So how do we support the sector to recover from the pandemic? But also reinvent is all about how do we also innovate and change and how do we work differently to support some of that. So we're not just coming back the same, but actually we're coming back better. And obviously part of that has to be that it's a more accessible, equal sector. So we're addressing those inequalities through that, improving the experiences of children and people in sport and physical activity. Yeah, and I think in terms of where volunteering fits within that, volunteering is very much part of what we're calling the people and leadership catalyst.
Okay.
And essentially what we see the catalyst as being is absolutely integral to unlocking some of these big issues. So they're actually going to help us accelerate and unlock some of the sort of big issues within the strategy. So the strategy itself sort of recognizes that none of this can happen without people, whether that's the people that volunteer in sport with activity, whether it's the workforce and the professionals working in the sector, whether that's people in communities who are just, doing that network weaving and connecting resources and assets in community to make sport and activity happen. People are absolutely integral to achieving this. So we sit as this catalyst, which is quite an exciting role to play, because actually what that means is, all of the big issues and all the different elements in the strategy, whether that's active travel or whether that's children and people or whether that's connecting communities or health and well-being, people in leadership and therefore volunteering is part of achieving all of those objectives. So we're in quite a unique role in terms of playing that kind of catalyst role. I think there's challenges in that means the scope of our work is potentially huge.
So how do you cope with that? Because it's no secret that Sporting have had some tricky figures post-COVID, with that some of the numbers are not where they would like them to be pre-pandemic. So how do you cope with that scope? How do you actually come up with a work plan that is achievable and isn't just overwhelming? You don't wake up in the morning and go, "Oh, I can't cope with all this. I'm not bothering."
Yeah, and Chris, specifically, I think honing in on that drop from 9 million to 6.2 million of volunteers that we're seeing through the data. How do those kind of big ambitious themes aim to address kind of that decline?
Yeah, so the change in the number as well is we also changed the measure very slightly to reflect community life. Yeah, the drop in volunteer numbers is a real concern. And I think in terms of how we intend to address that, I think there's different layers to that. What we've kind of set out in the strategy in terms of our priorities is a focus on the volunteer experience. So we know that for the most part, people who volunteer in sport with activity have a positive experience, but we also know that there's some really challenging experiences out there that people are having. And what we did see out of the back of COVID was that there was amazing resilience in terms of volunteers. They kept clubs going, they kept activity going in the community. They moved sessions online. They did everything they could to keep things going. But that's led to an element of fatigue and a bit of anxiety around the level of responsibility and commitment that they're required to give. And we've seen that in other data and research as well, not just within sport. So NCVO's Time Well Spent research that looked at the impact on the volunteer experience of COVID, again, showed similar things. So I think what we're seeing is that
other stuff to do, and getting them to come back is challenging. It's hard.
Yeah, and I think you've got to have a volunteer experience that I guess mitigates that is enjoyable enough and exciting enough that people want to choose to do it. When we think about sport and the experience there, it tends to be those who are giving more time on a regular basis that are sort of feeling anxious about the level of responsibility and the time commitment, and feeling, slightly more like, they're still motivated to take part, but actually the experience is they're losing some of the fun and enjoyment out of that, and the commitment levels are too high. So we need to think about how that needs to change.
I think that aligns as well with sport in general has moved to become more, even amateur sport has become more professionalised, and the clubs have got bigger and more involved. And, it used to be 15 years ago that in Manchester there was a lot of small football clubs, whereas now you've got a number of very large football clubs with lots and lots of teams. So the agency of the volunteer, if you will, is changed. The part of it, there's a smaller cog in a bigger wheel. So it does feel more commitment and more like a job often for some of the volunteers. I think there's something in that potentially.
But I think, and this is where, Kristen, I feel like we could probably go on for hours on this, but you've even got the perception of parents that actually some parents who utilise volunteers for activity, I think the Givers report that was a while ago showed that there's a perception that they're paid, and actually people don't realise that these coaches, these kind of officials, the committee roles that administrate the clubs and that side of things are all people gifting their time to community sport. And actually, there's expectations on there that are unrealistic on volunteers, and how do because there aren't some of the same policies around holiday and that side of things in volunteering, how do you create that culture and those behaviours that it's okay to have a holiday as a volunteer? Just help manage, share out the load so that you don't come back feeling guilty because you've taken a week off to live your life, you know, sort of that side of things. And I guess you had a really, really powerful fund that invested in around, was it over 30 projects for 4 years, wasn't it? Talk to us about some of the kind of practical learnings, lessons learned from that are shaping the future of tackling those equalities.
Yeah, so that there is a connection to what we were just saying around experience and how it needs to change, because the work that I guess partly drew me to the role at Sport England as well was this opportunity to lead a new volunteering fund, which is actually linked to our previous strategy, but is very much the insight and the learning from that, as you said, Imo, is absolutely feeding into and informing what we do next and disseminating that to our partners so we can support some of the practical changes that need to take place. So that fund was, from the previous strategy, it was all targeted at, I guess, testing and learning new approaches to recruiting more diverse volunteers into sport. So how can we engage new people into new and different innovative opportunities? Because there are some perceptions about sport volunteering that exist. It tends to be quite regular, quite structured, quite formal. People tend to see it as being in the traditional sports club environment. We still need all of that. It's still amazing. Most people are still having a really positive experience. So it's not about saying that that's wrong or that's not what we need, because we do need that. But what we wanted to test with this fund is, can we work with new and different partners, not necessarily sport partners? So within the partnerships, we've got disability organisations, we've got local charities, we've got local authorities, we've had volunteer centres, a whole range of different partners. Many of them were completely new to Sport England, hadn't had Sport England funding before. And we were sort of testing how they could develop new volunteering opportunities to get more people active. So it was really sort of looking at, you know, how can these roles look different? How can the experience be improved? And more important, how can it be more inclusive and accessible to a more diverse range of people? So within those projects, you can imagine there was a huge amount of different approaches, and you know we were really open in terms of, you know, the ideas and the creativity coming through, but also quite open to the fact that some of these approaches wouldn't work and didn't work how we expected. So allowing that kind of flexibility for people to say, you know what, we tried this, we tried micro volunteering and it didn't work for us. So what we've done is, you know, we've adapted and we've changed it and we've learned, and feeding that back to us. But what we've got from that fund, I guess, is, well, we've got a network of new diverse partners who are working with the type of audiences that we need to reach in the future, which is great. We've generated a huge amount of practical learning about, well, what does inclusive volunteering actually look like? What does that actually mean if you're an organisation offering sport and activity and you want to think differently about your volunteering?
And what does it mean?
What does it mean?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so that's what we've tried to unpack essentially in the outputs, which of course I'm going to say, please do go and read them, because there's a huge amount of detail in there.
So to access the research, it will be available in the link underneath the podcast.
Amazing, because there are some great kind of case studies and examples that bring it to life far better than I could. So I would point people there. Some of the things sort of feel like they're really obvious or that it's real common sense, but this kind of really allowed us to kind of evidence that this works. So things like just really understanding the barriers that the particular audience that you're trying to reach faces. We heard almost unanimously across different groups that they wanted flexibility and they wanted volunteering to fit within their lives. They didn't necessarily want to be, you know, restricted to just volunteering at a particular time of day or a particular day a week, or being asked to commit a certain amount of time. So, you know, you have to be with us for 6 months or something like that. They wanted flexibility, and they wanted, you know, the organisation to be really taking, I guess, a volunteer-centred approach, and almost shaping roles around the volunteer and the time they could offer, the skills they could offer. So it's almost thinking a bit more about tasks that people could do rather than traditional roles, which again sort of feels instinctive when you think about it. You know, what would you want? You would want someone to work around you. If you were giving your time, you would want someone to be flexible and responsive to that. But I think actually the reality is, especially in sport in many cases, that that's not quite the approach. The approach is that we offer a particular role and a time commitment and training, and for some people who are completely new to volunteering, not necessarily a member of a sports club, so they don't know how that world operates and works, that's quite intimidating. And their life might just not work in a way that means they can meet those types of commitment, or they want that level of responsibility. So that kind of idea of flexibility, you know, was really, really important, and taking a volunteer-centered approach. Those are the two kind of headlines. Yeah. What we tried to do with our evaluator CFE research is then trying to really distill that down into quick and easy practical guidance. So we've got an ADAPT framework in there, which sort of uses the ADAPT acronym to give some really practical tips around how they can do that. So how you can make it more adaptive and inclusive.
We do like an acronym here at TeamKinetic, so that's always nice.
Well, as long as you spell it out, that's all I'm saying, Chris. I love an acronym as long as I understand it, you know?
Well, in my case, as long as I can spell it full stop with my dyslexia, that's the other problem I have. No, it's really interesting that tension between flexibility and volunteer-centric versus the needs of the sector and the needs of the clubs and the needs of the organisations. Me and Jeff Nichols have had many a debate about the needs of the volunteer versus the needs of the, you know, the sort of the social entity that is the club or whatever. And he's sort of the traditional belief that, you know, people will do it if they're asked, and that's kind of the focus should be there, and the focus should be around making a compelling ask in the first place. And it shouldn't necessarily always be this is maybe just playing devil's advocate. People don't always necessarily have to have a good time, and people don't always have to necessarily enjoy it, but they have to feel what they're doing is making a difference and making an impact, and that's more important than necessarily them enjoying themselves when they're there, because there's lots of things you can potentially do and not enjoy yourself, but you still do it. So it's
interesting you say that. I feel like you've put a little catalyst for a bit of a debate out there, Chris, because I think it is absolutely important that volunteers need to enjoy what they do as well as being purposeful.
Enjoy as well. You know, do they have to be smiling and happy all the time because people who work at Samaritans aren't, but they still turn up every week?
No, but they can enjoy the team they're part of and the impact they're making.
That's what I mean. So that term "enjoy" is slightly low.
How you perceive it.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a really good debate and really interesting. And I think that word tension is a really useful one to describe it. And I think sort of thinking about, you know, your listeners as volunteer managers, what you're trying to do is manage that tension all the time. Because it doesn't have to be a negative thing. Like you can find a balance, and I think that's the challenge. And for a volunteer manager, you're trying to manage that tension all the time for individuals with different motivations and different levels of enjoyment, different things going on in their life. That's complex when you start to add those layers. But I think just having that recognition, understanding of it can't just be about what the club or what the opportunity needs to deliver. It has to be about the person as well. And I think that volunteer-centered piece doesn't mean you have to forget why that person's there giving their time in the first place, because they do need that, and evidence definitely shows that they want to see they're having an impact and that what they're doing is meaningful. That's so important. But actually you don't have to. There is a balance that I think you can strike. You don't have to, by taking a volunteer-centric approach, you know, have them doing something that's just quite fun, even though it's not actually contributing to the impact or the cause. But I mean, I go back to fairly often, and you know, it's a fantastic piece of research. So if there's any volunteer managers out there that haven't read it, it's old, but it's amazing. Pathways Through Participation, which was done years ago. It is a classic, but it's still so relevant, and it's so relevant to that debate. And you know, NCV will talk about it in their latest stuff around COVID and the impact on the volunteer experience. That tension and that tension between flexibility and, you know, and there's also the tension between digital and in person. And Pathways Through Participation for me hits the nail on the head when it basically just says, you know, volunteering doesn't happen in a bubble. volunteering is happening in the context of, you know, people's lives, of an organization in this wider kind of social, political, economic context. So as volunteer managers and volunteer involving organizations, whether it's in sport, arts, heritage, charity sector, health, you have to be conscious of that. And I think if you can be conscious of that kind of wider context that you're working in, you can then think about, right, okay, how do we create the right kind of structures and frameworks to allow people to kind of adapt and flex what they want from their volunteering right now? Because I think if you're able to do that in a fairly smooth way and make sure that what people are doing and how they give their time has an impact, then you're winning, basically. But that's a really challenge. It's an easy thing to say, a really challenging thing to actually do. But that is why the job's interesting. You know, it's how do you actually do that at scale? But almost having that idea of a spectrum of, you know, engagement and where that fits for you, where the different roles sit alongside that, and how you're going to allow people to move over time, rather than sort of that more traditional view that certainly when I started at NCVO seemed to be slightly more prominent, of the goal is get them into a role and let's keep them for 10 years.
Yeah.
we've moved on
in the right direction since then. And yeah. So I think I like I say, I've played devil's advocate, because I do tend to agree with what you say, that we need to take more effort to appreciate the volunteer and what they do and what they give and the impact they have. But like, getting that balance right between the needs of the volunteer and the needs of the organisation, that's spot on, I think.
And especially if we want to include new people.
Well,
because the old paradigm works for the people who have always been volunteering. That paradigm won't work for new, more diverse audiences who have never volunteered.
Yeah. And that idea of having a journey that's more accessible for those people, which is maybe taster sessions, or, you know, a little shorter time commitments, more discreet in the amount of time they've got to commit in the first instance, those kind of things that give them a initial experience of volunteering that's positive, that then maybe allows them to go into a further journey. Having as an organisation thinking about how you can create a situation where you can welcome new people it may force you to behave slightly differently as an organisation to make space for them, I guess.
Meeting people where they're at.
Yeah, and I think that links massively back to some of your earlier points, Kristen, about the culture and behaviours, and how that kind of understanding and being open to discuss how inclusive are we, and really hold the mirror up to kind of be ready to listen and then address it with the strategies from the things and the tools that you're kind of creating. Just where knowing that collaborate and creating that sense of collaboration is an important value and behaviour that you're trying to create through leadership and influence of Sport England, where you've had these projects that have kind of engaged with more cultural, arts-based organisations, how are you creating that kind of network of collaboration between what's traditionally been very sports-focused across the sector? Because that's probably where the role in NCVO, National Council of Volunteering Organisations, was quite charity-focused, and possibly now you're in a sports-dominated, but how do you get the two to meet? It is kind of almost, because is that where the power for the awareness and appreciation, when we go back to one of the 5 pillars of the vision of volunteering, actually unlocks, when you get that expertise in that sector crossing over with the expertise in sport?
Yeah, absolutely. And I completely agree. I've been calling it cross-pollination. When does the cross-pollination happen, and how can I help facilitate that? And I feel like that's still part of the challenge for me, that I'm trying to figure out, how do we do that really well? Because I think I agree with you that to me is where we could really make a difference, if we can get that right and get that happening more.
Even sports, never mind between sectors, between sports, between organisations like Parkrun and athletics, and you know, there's so much learning within the sector itself that could, you know, within the smaller parts of the sector that could be shared out or practice. It could be shared, I think. So yeah, no, I like cross-pollination. I might borrow that one.
I feel like that's the next series. We've done inclusion for this series, Chris. I feel like the cross-pollination series is coming. So if you're listening and you're from any of those cross-pollinating organisations, get in touch with Chris to make sure you get on the podcast. But back to you, Kristen, that learning and applying that learning from those funds, and how are you as an organisation and in your role as head of volunteering starting to create that network to kind of almost encourage that?
Yeah, so we're starting with, how do we, I guess, well, certainly in my role, I'm starting with how do I disseminate the learning from the fund and bring people together to connect and talk about it. So as you know, Imo, we bring together heads of volunteering and workforce leads from across sport. We bring them together. They're coming together next week. This is part of what we're going to talk about. But as I've said, what
on the podcast and tell them to subscribe, Kristen. So that
I know, but we need to get them out. We need to get them out, Chris, so that they can listen to it.
So we're going to be talking about it there. But again, as I said, this isn't just about me sort of saying, oh, look at what we've achieved and here's some learning. It's about having a conversation and creating those spaces and connecting people up to talk about what does this mean for their work and how are they going to change their practice as a result? What are the actions they're going to go away with? So it's prompting some of those questions or those conversations. Interestingly, the session next week is also alongside a session on vision for volunteering. So we're also sort of looking at those bigger strategic questions to really think strategically. So I guess, in the strategy, we have this ambition where we're connecting leaders and we're developing leaders. So developing leaders of volunteering to be really sort of connecting up together, talking about this, sharing good practice, yes, in sport and physical activity, but with some of the partners from the fund, I think we'd absolutely want to be starting to, really sort of mix that group up more and connect them up and start to really, as I say, cross-pollinate that learning across. So, whether it's an organisation like, we work with a really small charity in the Northeast that was working with refugees and asylum seekers. They had a very different model, to engaging volunteers, as you would imagine, to maybe a traditional sports club. Like if we could get different organizations in a room sort of sharing that learning, then I think that's where the energy is going to come from that bigger systemic change, which is going to take time. And I mean, that connecting up of, the learning and the insight that comes from the voluntary sector within sport was one of the reasons why I was excited about this job. And, the movement from, voluntary sector into sport. Yes, I have an interest in sport. I've always enjoyed sport and been an active person. So there's a personal interest there. But with the launch of the volunteering strategy, when I first joined Sport England back in 2017, I'd been interestingly sort of working as a consultant on that strategy when I was at NCVO with the Institute of Volunteering Research. So I kind of knew what was coming there in terms of a shift in direction away from, how do we retain volunteers and how do we get more volunteers in sport, to how do we diversify and make volunteering in sport more inclusive to a broader range of people so they can experience the benefits. That was the thing that really ignited my passion to do this role. And I was sort of thinking, well, actually, if I can lead this fund and we can sort of demonstrate how things might be done differently. And that's not to say there aren't exciting things happening in sport, Imo in England Netball has led some amazing stuff there. But so it's not to say that it's not an either or is what I'm saying. It's not that one's good and one's bad. How do we get the best of both? The best of both slices of the pie and mix them up and make like the best dessert you've ever had.
That's good. So we're running out of time, and there's a couple of sort of things that we tend to sort of come towards the end of the podcast. And normally it's quite a positive part of the podcast, but with the way the world is at the minute, we sort of ask you to reflect on what the future looks like. But the way it feels at the moment, what's going on in the world, it maybe not as a positive a reflection as we would. Well, hopefully you could prove me wrong, Kristen, and tell me that the future does look bright, and I've got nothing to worry about, and all I've got to do is buy a new kettle, and I'm good to go. My £1,000 energy bill. So, what's your thoughts for the future? I know you've touched upon quite a lot of that with the sort of plans you've got, with moving forward with Sport England, but in a more general sense within volunteering, what's your thoughts on the future of the sector and some of the problems that we can sort of see on bubbling away on the horizon right now?
Yeah, well, I think you can't sort of deny that there's going to be huge challenges, for us all, and particularly in, I guess, volunteering and the respective sectors that we work in. Whether that's cost of living, whether that's ongoing impact of COVID, persistent inequalities, so that those will still exist. But I think what's been really interesting to see, I guess, is how, to a certain extent, we have seen some coming together in terms of leadership in the volunteering space. So with things like Vision for Volunteering, AVM feels stronger than ever.
Yeah.
We've got that conference coming up in the autumn, and I sort of feel like actually there's a real sense of energy behind how do we actually change things now. We have some really sort of positive conversations and some quite visionary conversations, with other volunteer managers and the kind of leaders within the sector about how things need to change. But I think people really have an appetite to actually accelerate some of that stuff now. I think people have really got behind Vision for Volunteering and the priorities there, because let's face it, what things like the pandemic have done have shone a light on some of the existing challenges and problems and tensions we were already sort of dealing with within volunteer management, whether that's digital or in person, whether that's flexibility versus structure, whether that's, the inequalities which actually have to be at the center of everything we do, and how we tackle those. Those things were always there. I think what we've done is we've shone a spotlight on it, but actually with Vision and for other conversations, it sort of feels like we're actually starting to mobilize behind them now.
Yeah, it feels like there's been a drive that's forced people to move in the same direction, whereas maybe before people were sort of doing their own thing. It feels that post-COVID, the important sort of leaders within the various parts of the sector have kind of been squeezed together a little bit more, and there's a like I said, a general feeling of people trying to pull in the same direction rather than worrying necessarily just about their own organisation. There's a general sense of what can be achieved if people work a bit closer together. I think we work in Scotland and Wales quite a lot, and there's more national leadership generally there from their respective devolved governments. Where in England, it's generally been quite a fragmented picture we found with the various organisations we support, England and CVOs and AVMs and all that. There's a lot of leadership organisations, but sometimes not as much leadership, if that makes sense, because they're all kind of doing their own thing. And it feels that that's the Vision of Volunteering help pull some of that together, which I think is a really positive thing.
But I think there's live examples of experiencing what working together can lead to. So certainly, kind of in netball, restarting a game that was a contact sport in which we had to modify the rules to navigate that was an absolutely co-created, collaborated effort of staff and volunteers united to bring the sport back together safely. And I think that's almost where not only have you uncovered the challenges and how areas we need to accelerate, like digital, we've experienced what can happen when it happens, which I think is really, really special and powerful. And I know that we're not alone as a sport, that's kind of experienced that. And it's almost just given that sense of purpose. And when you drive behind that sense of purpose together, it's kind of like that there's I feel like I'm known for being a bit cheesy, but that quote about alone you can do so little, but together you can do so much. And if we can do that across our sports, but then we can do that across sports and then across the sector, that is bringing the vision and that collaboration, and that is what is exciting if we can unlock that together.
Yeah.
So, Imo, would you like to close with your normal question?
Well, we have, Chris, and we didn't give you any warning about this, so I'm sorry about that. Yeah, so 2 from you. You have a challenge where you give 2 words, one that reflects the kind of what volunteering means to you as a profession, and 1 word if you as a volunteer and what volunteering means to you kind of personally. So you only get 2 words, can possibly stretch to a hyphen if you need. But yeah, that's our little challenge in regards to finishing this
about
episode.
5 words, so we're
I know anyone that knows me would know that I'm not a 2-word person.
We get on so well, Kristen.
Okay, so sorry, it's what is volunteer
what volunteering means to
Volunteering.
you
Okay.
personally and professionally. One
Okay.
word that sums up what it means to you personally, and then one for professionally.
Okay. So personally for me, community, and professionally, relationships. So linked together, but
Yeah, I think that's
Smashed it.
a nice place to bring it to an end. A big thank you, Kristen, for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I'm sure you had other more pressing things to be dealing with than having a chat with us about this stuff. The research that we mentioned, we're going to pop in some links underneath the podcast. If anybody has any questions or anything they would like to follow up, then please feel free to send them to myself at pod@teamkinetic.co.uk. So feel free to drop any questions if you have, and we'll try our best to pick them up in future episodes. And nothing left for me to say, but have a lovely weekend, ladies, and hopefully we'll see you in real life at the AVM conference very, very soon.
Perfect. Thanks, Kristen. Thanks, Chris.